Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for this exciting event. I'm glad to finally have an audience at YQI and to also have some people joining us online. And we cannot wait to welcome external visitors on campus very soon. My name is Florian Cole. I'm the manager of the Yale Quantum Institute and the curator of this series of non-technical talks co-sponsored by their friends at the Frankie Program for Science and the Humanities. The goal of this event is to combat science phobia and to bring a new regard to quantum physics and science in general by having experts cast new light on often overlooked aspects of the scientific work. This series starting in the spring semester of 2017, and we discuss a variety of topics, among them the interaction of music and quantum physics, art and science, physics and dance, board games and space exploration, mathematics and crochet, and so on and so on. For this evening, we have the pleasure to welcome the multimedia artist, composer, and writer, Paul Miller, also known as DJ Spooky. His work immerses audiences in a blend of genres, global culture, environmental, social issues, and Paul Miller has collaborated with an array of recording artists, including Metallica, Chuck D, Steve Reich, and O'Connor, but also with renowned physicists like Brian Greene, Marcelo Gleiser, Stefan Alexander, and Jen Levent. His large-scale multimedia performance pieces, including Rebirth of a Nation, Terra Nova, that was commissioned by the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and the Soul Counterpoint that he wrote during his 2014 residency at the Seoul Institute of the Arts. And his big multimedia project, Quantopia, the evolution of the internet, that he will talk a little bit later on during this talk, was commissioned by San Francisco Archive, the Internet Archive, in 2019. We welcome Paul Miller in September as our third artist in residence at the Yale Quantum Institute. In this role, Paul Miller will interact with our faculty members, researchers, and students, attend our events and colloquials, and produce data-driven multimedia immersive artwork, which is based on the work of researchers at YQI and their collaboration. If you're interested in meeting Paul Miller with him and work with him, please reach out to me and I'll arrange a meeting for you. Tonight, we'll represent an informal history of invisible things. The talk will last about 45 minutes to 50 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. And if you are online, please use the Q&A feature to ask your question. Please help me welcome Paul Miller. Thank you.
First and foremost, I just want to say thanks so much to everyone for joining me. And I know it's a gorgeous weather outside, so it's a real treat to be with human beings, and you forget that the pandemic, it's been a very long 18 months, right? I mean, well, people in a room, who would guess? So what I want to do today is unpack a couple of issues that will give you guys a little bit of a foundation to some of the work I'll be looking at over the next several months, but also give you a bit of context to why the relationship between Yale Quantum Institute and me as an artist relates to kind of the legacy of what I think of as interdisciplinary approach to the sciences and the arts, and above all, creating a more robust conversation between science and art, and of course, the role of the composer and artist in the 21st century. So I have a tendency to be very nonlinear, so I'm not going to give you guys a normal straight ahead PowerPoint. So that's just the way it is. All right, we begin with a simple image. I wanted to kind of begin with this idea of pattern recognition in nature. This is broccoli, and amusingly enough, if you start to think about nature, biomimicry, and mathematics, there's always a relationship between how we look at pattern recognition and how pattern recognition actually informs almost all aspects of human cognition and how we put together the fragments of meaning that make up our, for lack of a word, I'm just going to make up a pun here, our cognitive bandwidth. And how much we process the information around us is based on, one could argue, whether you're David Hume, or for that matter, Rousseau, or fast forward to other philosophers like Deleuze and Guattari, or Jacques Derrida, you name it. The whole pun here is that pattern recognition is how human beings navigate the very complex world around us, and how it gives us grounding in a world that one could argue is filled with uncertainties, even about the basic humanity and the way that we relate to this complex universe around us. So if we jump from broccoli to fractals, this is a Mandelbrot set, you can easily see that there's a kind of a compelling relationship between mathematics and nature. And above all, nature, as the human evolves over the last several 100,000 years, we can easily see that we've been in this process of trying to, there's a very wonderful Israeli philosopher, Yuval Harari. If you haven't read *Sapiens*, it's a great book. Human beings have been involved with this notion of sort of suppressing aspects of nature as we move further into the 21st century. And the Industrial Revolution gave way to, one could argue, an information revolution. And now as we move further into a data-driven society, we'll be seeing far more engagements with disruption of nature. And of course, that's where environmentalists call now the Anthropocene era. So math, nature, and above all, pattern recognition. These are things that are compelling, but also deeply disturbed. The psychologist Sigmund Freud would call this the uncanny, the unheimlich. It's a German term for meaning unhomely, or at the edge of the familiar. So for many in the audience, this is a simple kind of graph diagram of a mathematical process. But if you bounce it off of nature and you see the same thing, and how this vegetable, for example, is just optimizing its relationship to sunlight to be able to optimize its relationship to resources, and above all, create, one could argue, a tasty meal. You know, it means that nature and humans, we are not separate. And above all, the 19th century, one could argue, took us down a strange path of industrialization and the idea of scarcity, and above all, this notion that capitalism had set up this kind of this notion of a deterministic universe, which leads me to this gentleman. This is Simon Pierre de Laplace. He was a gentleman who felt that at the beginning of maybe the middle of the 18th century, and I say the beginning, maybe the late 18th century, there was above all a relationship to revolution. One could argue the French and the Americans and many of the other kinds of global cultures were involved with a series of upheavals that many environmentalists have traced to what they call sort of the short ice age. There was a tremendous amount of crop failure in the mid 18th century because a volcanic eruption had sent a tremendous amount of particles into the atmosphere. And so winters were colder and longer, and summers were kind of faint. And so there's a lot of people who feel that the 18th century upheavals, including the revolutions, can be tied directly to climate change. But he wrote an essay that's going to inform some of the discussion today that in the English translation is just simply called A Philosophical Essay on Probabilities. And he felt that you could actually, if you had enough computational power, that you would be able to predict the movement of every particle making up the entire universe. Now here in the 21st century, our notion of computational realism, of being able to actually have the computational power to be able to engage this kind of thinking, it's a pretty powerful moment. And one can argue that the 18th century deterministic model, whether it's Newtonian classical physics, or whether later on one could argue that this kind of deterministic thinking set the tone for the 20th century's idea of the industrial psychology that led to all other elements being disrupted. When I say all other elements, for example, humans in nature, the idea of the human place as we move further into the Anthropocene, and above all, the idea that patterns were rigidly controlled and deterministic. The idea of free will, for example, and Facebook, free will and Facebook, and obviously there's a huge scandal right now. But if you look at Cambridge Analytica and many of the other data mining and data surveillance industries, they're based on this idea that it's relatively trivial to compute how human beings engage with the information around them and the patterns around them. And thus, things like Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, these are all computational machineries that are engaged with manipulation and above all sort of colonizing the subconscious as it moves further into a data-driven narrative. So Pierre-Simon Laplace, I'll just read this out loud just so everyone can kind of be on the same page here. He says, "We may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future. An intellect which at a certain moment would know all forces that set nature in motion and all positions of all items of which nature is composed. If this intellect were also vast enough to submit these data to analysis, it would embrace in a single formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the tiniest atom. For such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes." Now, whether you're an Aristotelian or someone who believes in the sort of Platonic ideals of the foundations of Western philosophy, this still relates to how we think about structure and its relationship to how a determinist versus indeterminate sort of cognitive process works. Now, other philosophers like Rousseau, for example, would call this sort of the unmoved mover, a daemon, D-A-E-M-O-N, that would imaginarily create a structure where you'd have to always be guessing. But guess what? You know, you can fast forward to Schrodinger and other kinds of physicists who are still influenced by this. And Schrodinger's infamous cat, you know, where you're able to think about the idea of randomness and chance operations. All of this still lingers over the conversation. So from these 18th century philosophers, Rousseau, Laplace, and so on, you can easily see that there was kind of a deep tension in philosophy and science. And of course, Newton navigated that and led the path for people like Einstein. So let's give you guys a little bit of context. I'm an artist, a writer, a musician who's deeply enmeshed in thinking about the conversation between science and the arts. My father was Dean of Howard University's Law School. I grew up in Washington, D.C. in the ancient 1970s. I'll just show you guys a quick, this is DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. in the early 70s. My mother was a historian of design, and my father was Dean of Howard University's Law School. So there was a tremendous amount of political activity at that time. You had J. Edgar Hoover, you had Nixon, the Vietnam War is raging. So some of the cases my father represented, for example, he was a lawyer for Angela Davis and the Black Panthers, very political. So our household was near DuPont Circle. I don't know if anybody here knows DC, but growing up in that region, there was, you know, you had the embassies, you had a very international and cosmopolitan scene. I had friends from China, Russia, India, Japan. So growing up in a downtown Washington, DC context, we also had, there was a vegetarian punk scene, for example. I don't know if you guys know bands like Fugazi, which was a Minor Threat, or Bad Brains. Anyone who's into thrash punk, I don't know if these, you know, you guys might not be into that, but it was popular at the time. So growing up in a cosmopolitan situation made me realize that the idea that science, the arts, and history were all kind of in this American uneasiness. And as we've seen during the pandemic, we're not just facing a biological pandemic, we're facing an ideological and political crisis based on the crisis of democracy as it collides with the social media and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and so on. So going back to that time period, the legacies I'm inherited are from that kind of era, critique of the political discourse, thinking about human rights, thinking about history, and this kind of disruptive innovation that was going on as the world became more and more digital. So fast forward to our current moment. This is some of my artwork. This is a fun remix of Lewis Carroll. I tend to always incorporate found materials. This is some of my visual artwork. I'm a big fan of Lewis Carroll, and obviously he was someone who would play with the mythology of mathematics, and many of his works, of course, Alice in Wonderland, are foundational to, one could argue, this sort of computational narratives that we inhabit now. In fact, the science fiction writer Neil Stephenson, if you haven't read his work, is a wonderful writer. His book Snow Crash, for example, he coined the term the metaverse, which if you haven't encountered, it's well worth exploring. So when you start to think about the visual arts, many of my other friends in this kind of context are artists such as Shep Fairey, who Shep, for example, made the Obama Hope poster, which became very popular in when Obama was running. There's also, you know, kind of all sorts of other artists who I think, you know, Shep does Obey. He went to RISD, and I went to Bowdoin College up in Maine. So I'm just giving you guys a little bit of context. If you haven't seen his work, you've probably seen the stickers that say Andre the Giant has a posse. Me and him, we've known each other since we were in college. You know, I went to Bowdoin, and RISD had better parties. So we would drive down to RISD on the weekends. All right, so you have a little bit of context. And now, how does this relate to science? Let's give you guys a little bit of a kind of interpretation. There's a very dear friend of mine named Margaret Atwood. If you haven't read her work, currently the world is feeling like one of her books, actually, The Handmaid's Tale. Margaret is a science fiction writer who uses feminist narratives to critique how we think about the near future and control of women's bodies. The Handmaid's Tale is an absolute classic, hands down, if you haven't read it. But she inspires a lot of my thinking right now about the legacy of the body and as it orientates in this world of, how should I put this, of coercive technologies. Now, some of my other work is presented in the context of installations at museums, galleries, things like that. One of my favorite concerts, and again, I'm just using this as an example, was we got the Greek government to give me the Acropolis for an evening. And I projected throughout the ruins of the Acropolis a very infamous film by D.W. Griffith called Birth of a Nation. And for those who are into film history, the film is deeply controversial, but it's considered the DNA of Hollywood. Basically, it's a film that shows, it's a KKK propaganda film. So just for the record, just to clarify, just to tell you guys as an audience, I can assure you I'm not a KKK member. You know? But basically, when I was in negotiations with the Greek government, they were like, but why do you want to play a KKK film at the Acropolis? And I was like, that's a good question. So I was like, look, you guys are Greek. You have comedy, tragedy. And they're like, oh, I get it. Okay. So what they did was they allowed me to put a sound system throughout the ruins. And what we ended up doing was projecting different versions of the film throughout the ruins. So the audience would come into, this is called the Herod Atticus Theater. It's the beginning of modern theater. If you think about this kind of semicircle, you can still see that as a logo for our modern movie theaters, for example. Now, you might be thinking, what does this have to do with science? I'm building up to that. But when you start to think about these kind of temple of reason, Athena and Pericles, and the idea that at that time, democracy was very fragile, and the competition between Sparta and Athens had generated this intense, for lack of a better word, critique of the individual and the state. So later on, the Romans came in, and obviously they took over. But this theater became the kind of basic premise of how rhetoric and how exchange of ideas, if you could look on further, of course, people like Aristotle, Plato, they would be hanging out in this area, and there was an area called the agora, the public space. So somebody would jump up on a stone and say, this is my philosophy, and then somebody else down the road would be saying, hey, this is my philosophy, and so on and so on. So what lingers over the conversation today is Pythagoras. I'm a huge fan of him. He was also a controversial figure. And for those who are into the history of mathematics, he's generally considered to be one of the first ancient philosophers to be able to combine tuning systems and math. So the thing about Greeks culture is that they didn't have zero. And zero obviously is incredibly important in the evolution of how we think about the arts, how we think about tuning systems, and how we think about our modern binary code that drives every digital device around you, zeros and ones. Now, Pythagoras was a deeply troubled person, one could argue. He had a cult of mathematicians around him. You were not allowed to see his face. He would speak through a veil, and he would only speak to you in equations. If you were not able to answer the equations, you were not worth speaking to. So he would, his most feared thing was the square root of -1. As a matter of fact, there's rumors that he would have you assassinated if you spoke the square root of -1 aloud, because he felt that it would unravel the universe. But what inspired Pythagoras as an ancient Greek philosopher was this tension between the public space and math. And if you look at I'll give you another example, the Oracle of Delphi, for example, all this goes to the heart of Western mathematics as tied into the social process. Nothing was separate. As one could argue, that interdisciplinary foundation of Western math inspired architecture, inspired philosophy, inspired pretty much everything that currently drives our society. So I'm giving you a little bit of context on this as a way of showing how art can intervene in architecture. Art can also intervene in the social process. And above all, how we think about contemporary practice as an interdisciplinary space. Now, there's plenty of other art projects, but I want to kind of give you guys a little bit of context as well, just for that arc. So this is a very famous situation from 1915. It's the Italian futurist, the gentleman on the left with the mustache. His name's Luigi Russolo. And basically at this time, he came up with this series of projects called futurism. And basically the futurist movement wanted to do invisible portraits of the accelerated landscape. And he felt that the science of the imagination, literally we call it the science of the imagination, was going to be about the tension of how a culture was accelerating because of industrialization. And he would have these futurist concerts. Now in 1915, the audience would walk into a room much like this, and the concert would be coming out of these crazy speakers. And so the audience would riot. People would throw bottles at him. They were booing, and they would say, where's the band? People were very upset that the music was coming out of these speakers. And so as if he's like, the music of the future will all be coming out of this. And if you can look above you and see all the little speakers, you can see who won. So from 1915 to our time period, you can usually see that the arts have had a nonlinear relationship, both with the industrial process, with how people think of the creative economy, and above all, how science informs the practice of this notion of sort of collapsing the silos between mediums. Now, another project that I just want to bring to your attention, I went to Antarctica for 6 weeks a little while ago, and there was a group of scientists working on a project called IceCube. Antarctica has some of the best landscapes in the world for studying the interaction of neutrinos. And what's beautiful about this project was I got a chance to really go deep into these larger landscapes of ice. And so when I was there, I was doing what I call acoustic portraits of ice. And ice is one of the stunningly beautiful material. It's quite, I'll show you in a moment, it's quite mathematical. But you can easily see this is a landscape of devastation. The landscape is collapsing, and you can easily see in the collapse that's scraping the entire side of a mountain, for example. Now, most of North America was carved by the retreat of the glaciers in the last several thousand years. And one could argue that we're in an accelerated, again, Anthropocene era, where nature and disruption have obviously, this summer was the wildest summer in human history. Forest fires, crazy weather patterns. So buckle up, it's going to get a lot deeper. And going to Antarctica from the heart of New York and then doing what I call these acoustic portraits was a real eye-opener about the legacy of deep time. What you're seeing here is tens of millions of years vanishing in the space of a couple of decades. And so we're looking at a collision of human time and deep time. And so as a composer, how do you engage that? How do you think about this notion of pattern recognition lingering over an entire rise of a species, our species, in such a short amount of time? So we're seeing the acceleration and disruption of the entire biome. And above all, we're also seeing that the human sense of agency has now created, a way of thinking about our imagination as applied to the entire universe around us. And, one could argue Laplace, Rousseau, maybe they weren't so far off. Maybe we are imagining it all, and our intervention in this is quite intriguing. So most of my books are published with MIT Press, and I've been working with MIT for many years. The current book that I'm working on now is called Digital Fictions. So I just want to show you this really quickly. This is a map. It's a little blurry for you. I'll just zoom in really quickly. It's called the Acoustic Wave Spectrum. And I used this in my last book because I wanted to show people macro versus micro level waveforms. So imagine a waveform that can, I'll just zoom in so hopefully you can see this, a waveform that would last over 1 million years. So you're looking at oceanic cycles, you're looking at tectonic plate movement, you're looking at, I'll just zoom out here, biospheric cycles, and then maybe we'll go down in the scale to, from millions of years to maybe a pattern that might last over several months. Global waves, seasonal cycles, and so on. Planetary cycles, rotation of different phenomena and atmosphere. Then if we zoom down to the frequency in cycles to the human range, which is usually our hearing is between 1 and 100,000 cycles per second. We hear and can interact with these kind of waveforms, mechanical oscillations, surface waves, what they call cavitation, conical waves, sound waves that obviously a truck going by or whatever. And then if we go below the human range down to a microacoustic level, millions of cycles per second, hundreds of thousands of cycles per second, you can easily start to see that it starts getting into the realm of quantum mechanics and other forms of, thinking about these micro levels. And the waveforms then become far more what you call electroacoustic, magnetoacoustic, photonic, and so on. And so the human ear obviously is not evolved to engage this mechanism, but technology, given our current process, we've been able to engage these kinds of waveforms and being able to then use them for all sorts of different approaches. Every device you have in your pocket, your cell phone, lights, all of this comes out of the engagement between obviously, the last century's notions of quantum mechanics, and then updated through the filter of what became a consumer culture based on that. So, these waveforms are all part of everyday life, but at the same time, there's a deep physics approach to how the human ear helps us navigate the world around us. So each of those is different kinds of processes. And I want to make sure that as an audience, you realize that this is information that can lead you down many paths. And I celebrate that. There's one of my favorite composers, also a Greek composer. His name's Yannis Anakis. And he began a kind of approach where he incorporated algorithms, and he called his style of composition the stochastic method. Now, here we are, the Yale Quantum Institute, and stochastic processes, obviously entropy and other kinds of things, those are, again, part of this notion of quantum engagement, and how do we think about that? But he would take ancient Greek mathematic formulas and turn them into symphonies. Me and him did a series of collaborations, and this is the beginning of my career. I had obviously a lot more hair back then. But the fun part about the way the ancient Greeks would think about math in the everyday was that it was part of this emotional engagement with how you thought about intervening in pattern recognition. So he's one of my favorite composers, and his work influences my thinking a lot. Again, he's one of the first composers to use algorithms to generate symphonies. Now, let's go to a little bit more current stuff. One project I'm working on now is what you call computational neuroscience. And what I've been doing is working on brainwave patterns. The human mind generates generally 5 waveform frequencies that are easy to quantify and measure: delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma. So obviously, each of those is a frequency waveform that the human ear doesn't pick up, but your brain is generating this. And so what I've been doing over the summer is working on sort of mapping out brainwave patterns and then using those to generate sound, and then being able to kind of balance meditation or other approaches to thinking about the brain and waveforms. This is a rough draft, and this is just an acoustic portrait of me thinking about some hip hop. So at the moment, this is a rough draft. It'll get more intense probably 2022. But I'm giving you guys little projects that can hopefully give you a bit of context about why I'm here with the Yale Quantum Institute. All right, so that's one project. And then I did want to make sure that you guys can also think about a little bit of the history of what inspires my work. This is a very famous, I collect vinyl. This is a very famous collaboration between 2 of my favorite composers, Sun Ra and John Cage. John Cage most famously created a piece called 4 minutes and 30 seconds, or is it 4 minutes, 33 seconds? I mean, it's a famous piece about silence, basically. And Sun Ra is a legendary figure who opened up the idea of noise and free jazz. The reason I think of these 2 and physics is both of them were inspired by interstellar phenomena and the idea of silence. Now, this is a very rare record. I've been collecting vinyl since I was a kid. And for me, at least, half of this stuff is always about the notion of the archive, like how you engage your archive, how you reactivate your archive, and then how that becomes a collage process. So these are all just bits and pieces. And by the way, I could easily put this in a slide format, but I'm sick of PowerPoint. So I like the idea of kind of a nonlinear scroll here. So over the last couple of months, I've been finishing a series of books, and some of my favorite authors, this is a gentleman by the name of William Gibson. If you're not familiar with his work, he coined the term cyberspace, for example, and his most famous book is called Neuromancer. So I'm very intrigued by the science fictional relationship right now of moving further into a data-driven society. And there's, say for example, there's a Chinese author who's a big influence on my work right now, Cixin Liu. He wrote this book, The 3 Body Problems, or the Dark Forest Trilogy. Gibson and the idea of cyberspace. Again, Neil Stephenson is another science fiction writer who influences my thinking with his term, the metaverse, all of which means that the science fictional relationship to the world around us. Other authors like Isaac Asimov or Philip K. Dick also kind of inform and inspire some of my work. So let's see, I want to make sure that you guys are getting a little bit of a broad spectrum. I've been also doing some volunteer work with reef restorations because I'm fascinated with how ocean currents and heat and temperature differentials can actually generate this idea, again, of living through pattern recognition, but also thinking about the Anthropocene and radical disruption of how nature is being wiped out by human, just human rapacity. So I do scuba diving. This is just kind of a series of fun initiatives where we're kind of dealing with putting reefs back together with, there's an island called Bonaire that I go to occasionally. I also go to Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, Tahiti, Fiji. And what we do is look at different reef destruction and then try and reboot them with either grafts where you can actually have different reefs from different regions of the world and help them heal. It's fun, it's interesting, but you can easily see there's a mathematical relationship going on here. And the way that the coral reefs are trying to optimize their relationship to the ocean currents and the salinity, the temperature differentials, the sunlight. Regretfully, the planet is on fire right now, and the climate crisis is, that's a whole different topic. But I'm heavily involved with a lot of climate active justice issues. This is one of my favorite projects at the moment. And actually, we're going to be hopefully going back there, or I will be going back later this year to do a series of sculptural projects and looking at how to sculpt the coral so that it can both be visually compelling, but also help it grow in a more robust way. And again, these are different, radically different projects I'm showing you guys, and I'm giving you guys the Cliff Notes version just because of time. Okay, let's see really quick. I'm trying as much as possible to give you guys a sensibility of both how I do research, but also how that research then informs my process. This is a gentleman who's also a big inspiration to me. His name's Al-Khwarizmi. And if you don't know his work, he was in the 8th and 9th century in Baghdad at the House of Wisdom. And he coined the term algorithm, which most Westerners do not know. It's an Arabic term. And the Arabs had borrowed these numbers, including 0, from the Hindu and their notion of Sanskrit mathematics. So his term basically became the foundation of Western math because of Fibonacci. And Musa al-Khwarizmi generally is considered to be, the other derivative of his name is algebra. So one could argue that the kind of conversation between East-West, between Islam and science, and the way Muslim culture actually helped preserve a lot of records that the ancient Greeks and Romans had taken one path in mathematics, but had not had 0, for example, which leads me to a conversation that inspires pretty much this entire residency. And I want to make sure to foreground this. So 2019 was the 50th anniversary of the internet. And I was commissioned to do a symphony celebrating this 50th anniversary. So from 1969 to 2019, the internet basically reached out and changed the way we think about pretty much everything. This is the internet in 1969. There was 4 hubs. The first 2 hubs went live in October 1969. And again, you guys are based in physics, so we can easily see an exponential notion of growth. So from October to December, you get the first 2 hubs were between UCLA and Stanford Research Institute. You can see those 2. And then by December, you have 4, then keep going, keep going, keep going. Next thing you know, you have billions and billions and billions of nodes. But if you were a composer looking at that notion of exponential growth, how would you turn that into a composition? So I was commissioned by the Internet Archive, which is a very incredible organization out of San Francisco, UCLA, and the San Francisco Young Women's Choir. So I reached out to the gentleman who wrote this equation. I just want to make sure you're aware of this. Generally, this is the equation that set up what you call packet switching, which allows the entire internet to work. And the idea was the US military through ARPANET needed a network to be able to send messages in case there was a nuclear war or if there was other disruption of major communication systems. So he figured out a clever way to break a message into component elements based on 0s and 1s. And essentially what I ended up doing was working with him, Dr. Leonard Kleinrock. If you look him up, he's generally considered to be one of the founders of the internet. Ended up working with him to kind of do a research into how we think about message component systems. And I then took that and made it become, so this is me and Dr. Leonard Kleinrock. And I took his equations and then had a chorus, the San Francisco Young Women's Choir, sing it. And I'll just show you what that would look like. So each young woman is singing parts of the equation. And then I have a string quartet that I'm sampling and running through my software. And this was presented at UCLA. And eventually what happens is you have more and more and more nodes, and the women are all wearing black. And so we're projecting on them. And I've taken the equation and then run it through a logarithmic series of growth patterns, so you can easily see its relationship to the exponential growth of the internet. So you're hearing all these young women's voices sort of cascading around the room, and then sampling the string quartet through various software that I use. So this is just kind of one project, but this is called Quantopia, which simply stands for Quantified Utopia. Now, each of the projects I'm presenting to you, you're getting like a 3 to 5 minute version, but generally they take months of research. You have to work with people who commission it. You have to work with, it's not every day you can be a composer and walk in and talk to the Greek government and get the Acropolis. I'm just saying. So each of these takes a tremendous amount of research and work, and it then becomes a concert or an installation or a series of conversations with data scientists or other artists. The reason I want to show you guys, these are all totally different projects, is that there has to be a conversation across silos. And what the problem with early 21st century is, many of us are in our own silo. As a matter of fact, if you're a Facebook group or this or that, mathematically speaking, you're just kind of in what, there's a theoretician named Eli Parser would call the filter bubble. You just keep getting the same thing because you're in your silo. I want to break down those silos, and I'd like to communicate across mediums and across disciplines. So that's what this residency is about. And I'll be kind of working with the Yale Quantum Institute over the next several months, and working with scientists and other people from your community to figure out a compelling way to kind of compose and generate art based on this idea of breaking down those silos. One of the inspirations for the residency is a conversation between these two gentlemen. On the right, you have Rabindranath Tagore, who is a Bengali Hindu poet. And on the left was Einstein. So these guys met backstage at the Nobel Prize Awards and stayed in touch. Einstein, they had the coolest haircuts in the room. And what ended up happening is they just got into a series of debates and discussions. And Einstein said to Rabindranath Tagore famously, when I'm working on an equation and I can't finish the equation, I go play violin. And people tend to forget Einstein was quite a talented violinist. And so he actually, some of his favorite compositions are stuff like Bach's Mass in B minor or Bach's Goldberg variations, which are quite mathematical. And so Rabindranath Tagore said, you know, the problem with your Western music is you guys didn't have zero. And your music's too simple, and you guys are all playing minor chord or major chord. And so if you listen to Indian music, you can easily hear this rich complexity of tonality because they incorporated mathematics into the music at a much earlier phase in their culture. The West was still based on the Greek model, again, Pythagoras, Heraclitus. And you can easily hear that whole tone. Whenever you hear hip hop, techno, rock, jazz, any of our current music, it's still based on mainly those Greek tuning systems, minor chord, major chord. If anyone wants to get more technical, it's like Lydian, Phrygian, Aeolian. Those are all ancient Greek tribes that just played a specific style of music. And again, if anybody, I don't want to lose half the audience by getting in more technical with music, but long story short, these guys began a correspondence, and their correspondence was about physics and poetry. And it ended up becoming a book called On the Nature of Reality. It's a great book where you have one of the world's leading poets talking to one of the world's leading physicists. And the conversation between that creative ebb and flow is what inspires me for this residency. I'm a big fan of this idea of people reaching across different cultural boundaries and across different silos. And how the 21st century is moving is that everyone is being put in a data bubble based on your algorithmic preferences and the coercion and surveillance of all of these different social media platforms. So it's time to be human again, maybe, and just be in a room with people. And I guess still the pandemic, and by the way, I'm fully vaccinated, but I'm a big fan of thinking about how do we break down these kinds of issues and use them as building blocks for conversation across the mediums. So given our time frame, it's 5:42. I know that time is tight, so I'm going to just kind of go to this one quote that I really enjoy using from Einstein, where he says, "Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world." So to me, at least, the imagination is the ultimate renewable resource. We have to think about resilience, we have to think about sustainability, and we have to think about the climate crisis as basically having to incentivize us to rethink our relationship to the patterns that we've disrupted in the world around us. And that's where quantum physics, and above all, thinking about quantum computing, will hopefully allow us to have a better and more robust, and for one could argue, a more powerful conversation with how to restore some of the patterns that we've disrupted. Now, if we unpack this phrase from the viewpoint of the arts and thinking about algorithmic processes and mathematics and quantum mechanics, the idea of being able to imagine something that you're unfamiliar with implies that you have to explore nuance, and you have to be able to kind of, if there's a word that you haven't used and you've never heard of, will you have that vocabulary? If there's an equation or an approach to something that you've never engaged, will you be able to think about it? And one could argue philosophically that you might not have the cognitive processes or structures because you've never heard that before, or you've never thought of that before. So the idea for the residency is to kind of be a provocation and to kind of apply the logic of the DJ, which is about remixing, sampling, collage, the mashup, to this notion of how science and the arts can kind of have a better and more robust conversation. And to me, at least, that's a beginning. We're going to see the evolution of that over the next year. And eventually, I just want to show you, when I got back from Antarctica, I just want to show you really quick. So I went from this, which is one of the most remote places on Earth, and seeing this massive, it looked like a nuclear bomb had gone off, and the whole continent, it's melting. I mean, let's just be clear here. You can easily see that ice is collapsing. The human scale of this is so mind-boggling. And so once you think about the idea of scalability of experience, patterns are what allow us to navigate these kind of issues. So when I got back, we had a concert, you know, kind of where me and a group of other artists did a series of music pieces. And each of us did a different style. I worked with the hip hop group, The Roots, which I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with. And there also another group called The Flaming Lips. And each of us did a different approach. So I did one style, they did one style. And I just want to show you the concert. It's a lot of photos here. I always forget which. But essentially, the concert was one of the largest. It was for Earth Day. And what we did was try as much as possible to kind of engage the notion of how people would think about Earth Day and disruption, and giving people better tools for critical thinking. To me, at least, that's one of the most powerful things we can have. And it really gives us a sensibility that the imagination, like I was saying earlier, is the ultimate renewable resource. How do we get people to rethink the process of reimagining what is possible? For one reason or other, I can't seem to find the concert photo, but it was a big concert. It was fun. I don't know if you guys know the Flaming Lips or the Roots. It was a popular show. So let's see, one other thing, let's see. Trying to make sure to give you guys some context. This is what I do normally, like kids are rocking out. That's about 10,000 people in front of the stage. The amusing if all these girls are throwing their bra on the stage. Very un-PC, you know, to say that, but it's real. I mean, so this is the view from the DJ booth. So I normally, you know, playing beats and people are like, you know, rocking and stuff like that. So this is not what I'm going to be doing with Yale. Although maybe we can make some quantum hip hop, we'll figure. But the fun part about this is that it is a social process, and to be able to have fun and also be able to get the conversation moving outside of the silos and being able to break those silos down, that's what's going to be the next several months of what's going on. So yeah, so the concert that we did for Earth Day was something like that, but all the music that I had made was generated by the recordings I made in Antarctica. And, you know, amusingly and strangely enough, when you start to think about project, the research that goes into the project is what makes part of it so intriguing to me. So I'll be coming up here kind of over the next several months and just kind of having a series of engagements with scientists, with creatives, and above all, with people. I'm just trying to figure, where is that? I have so many freaking photos. There's various videos I could show you guys. There's various, oh yeah, here we go. So for this one, we had about 1 million plus people, and that's me DJing. We filled the entire, this is at the DC Mall, it's in a massive space. So all the music I was playing was generated in Antarctica, and I took the sound of ice, I took the sound of the temperature differentials, and then made electronic music out of it. And then the Flaming Lips came out and they did their part of the concert where they're like an art rock band. I'm more hip hop. It's again, the idea was to build bridge between styles. And then the Roots came out and they're more straight up normal hip hop. But I usually do large scale music festivals. And so the audience was into it because the whole concert was based on the sounds of nature that had been cut up, spliced and diced into electronic music. So it was, you could party to the sound of climate change in the Anthropocene era. So the good news out of that is that the audience was able to relate to the fact that you could actually make an acoustic portrait of climate change, and that helped raise awareness. And we also had a political engagement with raising more awareness about climate change and climate justice. To me, that's a really critical issue of our time, and it's going to be, if I would be surprised if our species makes it out of this century. Personally, I know that sounds a little cynical, but it's pretty bleak. So there's plenty of other stuff I could chat about. I do want to leave time. It's 5:50.
Well, could you
give
us a little sound, since you keep showing us pictures of sounds? Are you going to give us a little sample of some sounds?
Sure. I mean, I was going to play a mashup just to give you a sense of how I was scratching. And also, there's plenty of video of me doing stuff on the internet anyway. By the way, I do want to thank you for bringing it up, and I will play one thing in one moment. But I do want to emphasize, I mean, this is like, just going to some, it's not every day you have a DJ from New York go to the middle of Antarctica.
I thought you were going to say to New Haven. The middle of
you guys have quite a few DJs coming through here, I'm pretty sure. But the idea here is, think about this as a pattern that's in disruption. You're seeing the collapse of an entire glacial shelf. As a matter of fact, a lot of scientists are saying that essentially this entire area is now collapsing into the ocean. When I was there, it took about 8 hours to walk from that water all the way up to the side of this mountain. And I was very hot because you're moving, and by the time I got to the top of the mountain, I'd been wearing all this gear, and I was like, oh my God, I was frying. So each of these projects requires a tremendous amount of editing, recording, documentation. But when I got back from going to this and then had the concert for Earth Day, the audience doesn't see all that. They want like a party or something that's, kind of immersive and fun. So for me, at least, this idea of the research is where I derive personal satisfaction. Let me play you guys. I mean, I have lots of albums out too, but the Antarctica project is particularly resonant with Yale right now, because I think that a lot of it's going to be about these conversations with scientists. And by the way, Antarctica is the only place on Earth with no government. So I made the entire project open source. And the idea is that you can take the climate data and make your own remixes. All of this is available on my website. If you go to djspooky.com, and I'll just show you really quickly. The idea was, as much as possible, to reference, let's see. Yeah, okay. So what I did was take those temperature differentials. This is temperature over several years. You're just seeing a small sliver of it. And then take the temperature differentials, assign them to music tone patterns, then use those patterns to generate what you call an algorithmic musical transcription of weather over a long period of time, and then use that to generate music based on these different algorithmic transcriptions. Again, I can get more technical if you ever want, but basically it's patterns that you can put into different tempos. So house music, techno, dubstep, hip hop, they're all patterns. So once you have the basic pattern of the weather and the temperature differentials, I was able to take that and make an open source album. The album is on my website. If you just go to djspooky.com/Antarctica, all of the data is there, and it was done with Dartmouth's Cold Regions Research Labs. Each of these projects I could do an entire talk on just for that project, but I do want to show you that we're lifting the hood of the car a little bit, so this is just a little backdrop. Each of these projects could be full on, but I do want to just show you really quickly the inspiration for that project was this gentleman, Johannes Kepler. And basically he was on his way home in the middle of a snowstorm. And he basically realized a piece of ice had landed on his sleeve, and he wrote the first equations defining the geometry of ice. And basically, it's pretty wild. This is in the year 1611, and he's on his way home in the middle of a snowstorm, and this like a piece of ice lands on his sleeve, and he realizes how geometric it is, and basically ends up thinking about the geometry of ice as the foundations for this book, The Six Sides of a Snowflake. So it's the first time you have a mathematical interpretation of the geometry of ice. And you realize you can see the geometry of ice pretty clearly, pretty easily. And what you're seeing is permutations of the changing same. This is literally the same. If you took the same equation, you would be able to generate different things. So I was like, oh, let's take the equation. So what I did was run it through different patterns. And I took Kepler's material, used it to generate more and more fractal kind of relationships. And you realize after enough computation, you can have synthetic ice. And so basically each of these projects, there's the science component and then there's the fun component. So as an artist, I was trying to sort of balance the two because if you make it too much, then you lose some of the audience. And if you make it too little, then you lose some of the audience. So the good idea is to just be able to balance. So for example, like I was showing you earlier, eventually, for example, this is one of the installation pieces we had at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I took the geometry of the ice, I worked with a group of architects, and we developed a series of sculptures that we projected on. That was like the art version. And then that other one where like 1 million+ people for Earth Day, that was the party version. So there's plenty of other stuff I could show you guys, but I just want to wrap up because it's 5:55. This is a very, I think, an inspirational piece from Richard Dawkins, where he says, science is the poetry of reality. I began my discussion by showing you guys the conversation between Einstein and Rabindranath Tagore, and I'll end with Dawkins, where this simple phrase is, I think, an elegant distillation of some of the ideas that are going to be inspiring the residency over the next several months. And so the idea is to work with you all, work with the Institute, and see what we can do from the conversation. And again, to go back to the ancient Greeks, they would call this a dialectical process. You have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So the gentleman asked for some music. Mm-hmm. I can play you, there's different versions of everything, because that's what the idea of DJ culture is, remix and mashup. So I just want to play you one that I find amusing, but it's not definitive of my style. A lot of people, like if you hear the Roots, you hear their style, or if you hear Radiohead, you hear their style. For DJ culture, anything goes. I can take any style and flip it around. So I'll play you, because I grew up in the ancient 1990s, when you guys weren't born. This is a kind of a fun one. I'll just play you a quick clip. So that's not what you guys are getting, the art mix. That's the party mix. So just just to clarify there, that would work for like, concerts and parties like this, so you guys are getting a different mix, just so you guys are getting the academic mix. So
all of it. All of it. Yeah, the silent. Exactly.
Yeah, so that one you need a big sound system and a lot of bass. So,
so we're trying to work with the Shortland Center to try to organize some fun events.
This is the fun mix. So I'm giving you guys the science and stuff like that. But yeah, so just so you're aware, like I said, I inhabit different ecosystems. So that is probably you got to have lasers and fog. Like if maybe you guys would come in the room, I have like lasers going or something.
You have some lasers.
Physics is lasers. There you go. All right. So thank you guys so much for your time. And just it's Florian, how do you want to? Should we?
If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. I'll monitor the chats to make sure that we have the question from the audience here.
Okay.
Answered. Yeah. Question for
I was wondering, like, when you collect, let's say, like weather patterns, right? It's got like this interesting pattern, and then you transform it into the acoustic domain. Do you have any idea how it's going to sound, or is that always a surprise?
You know, there's a couple approaches. I've worked with the mathematician. I'll just show you really quickly. Stephen Wolfram, who's probably a pretty legendary mathematician. I'll just show you tones. So this is a project where you can basically compute any style, and hip hop, techno, dubstep, they're usually in 4/4 tempo, for example, which is relatively trivial to compute. Then you have minor chord. Usually most hip hop and techno are minor chord, etc. So you were able to actually click on these and start using it to generate MIDI and export the MIDI and then pull that into an editing, what they call digital audio workstation, DAW. So when I'm working on a project, I normally don't have the end result in mind. The process of making the material, it depends on the situation. Like if I'm going for, you guys are more of like, I don't view today as a party mix, so I would probably not be. But that's what I was mentioning earlier. I have many styles. I'm using this as an example because he was able to compute almost every aspect of, again, using an algorithmic approach to all of the major formats of music. But for me, at least, I'm very interested in thinking about existing in multiple ecosystems. So hip hop might not work for certain things, and then house music might work for other things, and classical music might work for other things. And above all, the notion of fidelity to the data is not my foundation. A lot of people would say you should only, there's certain other composers, like Ryoji Ikeda, and you may probably, I have a feeling he's not well known here. He's a Japanese composer, he's interesting. He'll do visual installations based on a granular synthesis, and he's very specific about that. And he projects at a large scale, like small dots and stuff. He's very Japanese, German minimalism. That's, again, like not like a party, or he has very, I'm using him as an example. There's other artists doing sound art. Usually they avoid beats. So you'll go to a gallery and there'll be like some noise or some sort of glitchy or skipping CD sound or something, but they never have beats. And so on the other hand, I go more for, kind of incorporating beats with the science. But again, I'm never sure quite if it's going to be an exact match, but it should be a good beginning point.
Yeah, so you're wondering, so you were saying that kind of with quantum computing and things that we do at Yale, it's comes a lot of opportunity, and I was wondering, because it also coming with that is a lot of responsibility. What you choose to make the quantum algorithms for example, I mean, a little bit further in the future, but more or less they're heading it. So it seems that this is a very nice opportunity to mix kind of art and philosophy and science all together. So are you thinking in your project that you're going to be able to incorporate that sense of responsibility and those kind of ethical questions about what we work on at all, or is that maybe not part of that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated with entanglement, for example, and I'm going to use the idea of quantum entanglement as kind of a foundation for probably what's part of the residency to look at. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance, for example. So when you're thinking about the ethics of being a composer talking with scientists, or a composer engaging with, kind of things outside of their normal domain, you have to imagine that it's the beginning of a conversation, and how that conversation goes is the dialectic. This is just beginning. So over the next, I think, is it 12 or 15 months? 12 months. Yes. For me, that's millennia. Normally, I do a project in like a month, maybe. So I will be coming up to Yale, and also we're going to host a series of events in New York as well, which you guys are all welcome to join. We will have, you know, I'll have more of a firm date for some of the New York events, but the idea is the dialectic. And I'm very intrigued with how the dialectical process is at the heart both of science and replicatability. If you go back to, again, the ancient Greeks doing, you know, experiments and trying to figure out things, I'm inspired by that because it was like they were just trying to figure it out. And it was kind of like, you know, if you're Archimedes, you're like, I can move the entire world if I put a lever in the right place. And okay, how do you calculate that? And he calculates the entire circumference of the world. You know, there's all sorts of intriguing possibilities, but the ethics of science versus the arts is it's a very ambiguous place right now. One could argue that the imagination can be weaponized too, which some people, like, for example, if you're talking about entanglement, they've already got satellites in orbit using quantum entanglement. The Chinese launched a satellite a little while ago. America has launched some military satellites. They're supposed to be unbreakable encryption because of the entanglement and all sorts of other processes that go into that. You know, military applications of quantum physics is definitely a serious issue. But one also has to remember, if the Americans aren't doing it, the Israelis are doing it. If not the Israelis, then the Chinese. And if it's not the Chinese, it's the Russians. And everybody is trying to figure this stuff out. And usually it's for some military stuff, personally. And so as an artist waltzing through the room, you know, I don't have a machine gun or extra lasers to fire at anybody. But it's the beginning of a conversation to me about how the arts can help make a better and non-military approach to things. A lot of this stuff is being weaponized immediately, like military funding for quantum research is pretty serious. I'm not familiar with all the numbers, but I know it's a very significant amount of money being put by the government. All major governments are their military for like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and so on. Yeah, so.
We have a question in the chat here. They say, Antarctica experience is very cool and I appreciate your focus on climate change. They advise to work with the Yale School of Environment this year. And then also they have a question, have you collected human or human sounds in Antarctica and integrated these into your music?
I'll answer part 2 first and then go to the first part. You know, I wasn't interested in human sounds in Antarctica. I was interested in the sounds more of nature's processes because everything has a rhythm. Even the absence of a rhythm is kind of a rhythm. So the wind, water, even neutrinos. I tried an experiment with it that is probably called Ice Cube in Antarctica. That's a neutrino measurement center where they're looking at the impact of neutrinos through the ice. That was interesting. Human sounds, there's a lot of other artists doing that. So if you just Google like sound art, there's zillions of people doing stuff. In fact, there's one whose work I do like, Marcus Buhler at MIT. He's been doing stuff with the sound of DNA, and he's been doing, his most infamous piece was he took the DNA of the COVID virus and made a series of electronic music pieces out of the COVID. You know, which it sounds like experimental electronic music, like no beats or anything. It's just, so the other thing is, I would love to work with Yale's environmental department. In fact, hopefully we'll reach out to them over the next couple of months.
Any other question in the audience? If not, let's thank Formula again.
I do want to just mention everybody, everything I'm talking about, I'm a big fan of what you call open source culture. So much of the work that I'm doing is open source, and on my website, there's articles, there's downloadable material, there's articles and books. My books are with MIT. Lately, I've been really interested in this idea of curating. I just curated a big exhibition about Afrofuturism, which is another art movement that's pretty cool. And yeah, I'm a big fan of the dialectic process. So thank you guys so much for coming out, and I hope to see you guys over the next couple of months.